Are we on item number 5 now? Yes.
Yes.
Special report on city contracting practices.
Excellent. So, caveat, this is not an audit. It is actually the summary of many audits. So both to this committee and even predating many of the members of this committee, we have presented many a contract audit to you guys. We're often talking about kind of city contracting practices, but we're usually talking about it from a single audit perspective. So we went and looked at this one contract or this type of contract. And so today we want to present a little bit more kind of broadly what all of those audits have been showing us over the last several years. So Katie Houston was the manager of that audit. Henry Katuma was the auditor in charge, and Katie will present.
Good morning. So like Corey said, the purpose of this project was to evaluate the city's approach to contract management. And it's really what I like to call a compilation type project. So we looked back at all of our contracting work going back to 2010, which is the last time we did a project of this nature. And for the last 8 years, we focused on kind of the recommendations we've made and the risks we've seen that relate to contracting in the city. Our work focused on 28 projects, 21 were audits, and 7 were investigations. And as you can see here, contracting is a big deal. We have almost 2,700 throughout the city, and it's a big investment of about $5.5 billion. Recently, we've seen quite a few risks in many audits that have indicated we need to take a look at this a little more thoroughly. And this is a summary of that work. So here you can see a depiction of the contract management process. It starts at the top with initiation, which is essentially when the departments identify the need to contract for goods and services. Next, we go to the award, which is when we're evaluating and selecting the appropriate vendor. Then we develop a contract, which is just the formal agreement between the two parties. Then we monitor. This is primarily when the city departments are evaluating contractor performance and ensuring they're complying with the contract terms. And then lastly, we close it out. For the most part, you're just wrapping up the final details and doing a vendor evaluation. On the right, you can see the key department responsibilities. Essentially, the Corporate Purchasing Office is responsible for developing contracts and dealing with vendor disputes. They also provide citywide guidance on how departments should be managing these contracts. The Law Department really protects the city's interests and provides legal advice to the city. Capital Contracting procures construction and public works for professional services. And then the individual departments, like I said, they kind of initiate the process by identifying a need, and then they do the bulk of the monitoring. So as we looked back at our work, we found that 3 of the 21 audits that related to contracts addressed some issue relating to contract initiation. And some of the key issues we found there are that there were projects designed without a full quality review, and partially due to the city's decentralized contract management approach, we saw that there was limited coordination between the various departments. We also found that 3 of the 21 audits we reviewed identified issues relating to contract award. And more specifically, we saw that there are contracts awarded that didn't follow established procedures, some of which bypassed competitive procurement rules. And then we also saw inconsistent use of vendor evaluations. Moving into development, we saw quite a few more problems in this area. About half of the audits we looked at and 1 investigation identified issues relating to contract development. And some of the key issues we found here are poorly developed terms. A good example of that is the term unduplicated client served. We see that in a lot of social services contracts, and that is not clear enough to be effectively monitored by the departments. We also saw instances where some key clauses were modified or left out. We saw that last month when we heard about the cultural arts audit. No or limited legal review, and then sometimes there were instances where contracts were developed based more on what third parties offered to provide rather than established city priorities. The next step in the process is contract monitoring, and this is the area where we saw kind of the most pervasive problems. 17 of the 21 audits, or 81%, had a problem in this area, in addition to 6 investigations. And some of the key issues we noted were that monitoring procedures are not always documented, that we're not always performing on-site review of contractors, that contractors are not monitored to ensure they're really complying with the terms. Some good examples of that would be departments maybe not obtaining or reviewing good supporting documentation for requests for reimbursements, invoices, receipts, things of that nature. And then we also saw that some contracts were signed before all the required approvals were obtained. So at the end of the contract, or after the contract's been finished out, it goes through a closeout process, and kind of this is the area where we saw the fewest problems, but what we did see related to the vendor evaluation component, many times those are not done, or when they are done, they're not used in future contracting decisions, and we saw some of that in the capital projects audit. So in addition to that, we also noted a couple observations. The first is that many recommendations are made or have been made to address these contracting risks over the last 8 years. But there's a lot of work that's still needed. We know that there are some instances where recommendations really weren't implemented at all. We heard about that a little bit in follow-up already. And then we know there are other cases where maybe the recommendation was implemented, but the risk environment has changed or something, maybe it wasn't kept up after it was implemented. So the risks noted in the original audits still remain or aren't really fully addressed. Beyond that, we know that the purchasing department provides some training to city staff on how they should manage and monitor these contracts, but the trainings that are mandatory that city staff are required to go to are systems focused. So it's kind of training staff on how to use the city's financial system or how to upload data to eCapri. There's some better trainings, or at least trainings that give you maybe more meaningful information on how to really monitor contractor performance and look at receipts and obtain good supporting documentation, those types of things. But those aren't required, and few city employees are attending those. And our understanding is the purchasing department's working on that now. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Councilmember Alter?
Thank you. So my office is looking closely at contract issues and trying to understand how we can improve them. We had a conversation the other day about the training and how that might need to be improved. Is that something that is something that we have to write up a resolution on, or is that something that we simply talk with the city managers? I mean, there's a fine line there about getting into the management, but it seems to be creating systemic issues and maybe policy. So I just wanted to get a sense of what would be the best avenue on that with the training, because I've heard that from multiple departments as well as, from your audit.
Mm-hmm. So the training, the purchasing department has a toolbox that has lots of tools in it, checklists, good resources on how to really monitor these contracts. So the resources are available. I think the issue is what we were previously requiring folks to go to and what we offer as sort of optional training are not the same. And so I don't necessarily think there would need to be policy direction for that. Just express interest that maybe we decide that some of those other optional trainings are now made mandatory, and I think the purchasing department is on board with that, and they're considering that now.
Mr. Scarborough, did you want to speak to that?
Sure. James Scarborough, Purchasing Office. I appreciate the question. I appreciate the conversation and the review of contracting and procurement operations. Most of the standards and the context in which the analysis in this report or the past audits were done were based on approaches, techniques, and tools that were established and have been maintained for the years by the purchasing office. And that is correct. We provide a variety of resources, including training. Some of them are mandatory because you're working in the financial system, and so you can't make mistakes in the financial system. Other activities are voluntary because different departments have different levels of authority. And to the extent that some departments need to know certain procedures and use them, and certain departments do not need to know those procedures because they don't ever perform that function. That has been a point of discussion in the past. So the financial services group, the chief financial officers management team, we're reviewing this report now and considering it internally and determining if a better approach with regard to training might be an element in solving the problem. But just making folks go to training won't necessarily cause the outcome to change. We also need to look at, what what do we do when the outcome is not what we want to see? And how do we monitor that so that we don't have to wait for an audit, we don't have to wait for a report, we catch it when it happens. So we're also looking at not just inputs to the problems, but also looking at outputs so that we catch it before it happens.
Okay. I'll take the rest of my questions offline with you.
Sure.
So I had a lot of questions about this. I think this was a really helpful format, first of all, for y'all to kind of compile the work that you've done on lots of audits, so that we can really see where the issues were. Looking at the special report, so I have a couple of specific questions, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So on page 6, it said the capital project delivery process audit found Public Works Management authorized staff to overlook comments from the Quality Management Division on the designs for the new central library. As a result, staff submitted the designs for bid and construction without subjecting them to the full quality management process. In some cases, external pressure regarding high-profile or time-sensitive projects resulted in modified or expedited quality reviews. Did that, I mean, I understand that when you have a high-profile project, I understand the different external pressures that people are wanting to get completed in time. Was that specific, but I also know that there have been some design flaws in the new library that have led to like sewage issues and some other things. Do you know if there was anything specific that resulted from the kind of lack of following protocol and quality management in regards to the central library?
So this comes out of an audit that we issued, I'm trying to remember the timeline, maybe October 2017, give or take, about a year
Sure.
ago,
Yeah.
give or take. And certainly the library was one of the projects that we spoke about in that audit. I don't know specifically about sewage issues. There is one specific issue in there, certainly, where we note that a design issue resulted in additional cost. It basically had to do with a fire kind of protection where they didn't have electricity exactly where they needed it. But I think that was one example. We used several examples in that report where we say we think that if we had done this design review a little more thoroughly, we would have solved some of the issues that came up later in construction, maybe even post-construction. So we can get you more detail on what we specifically said about that project. But kind of this is the very summarized version of what that larger audit spoke
Right.
to.
Assistant Director, oops. That was a surprise. Sorry about that. Jorge Morales, Assistant Director in Public Works over the Capital Delivery Program. That was part of the Capital Delivery audit that we did a couple of years ago. And the comments, I would have to actually get the comments to be very specific, but the Quality Management Division, what they do is review for quality assurance. And sometimes the comments are addressed, sometimes they're not. So we can go back and get specifics on what that was referring to, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they were overriding a design type requirement. As it relates to the sewer issues, we're investigating that right now, so there's a lot of information that we're evaluating on what occurred there. It may be design related, may be construction related.
Okay, yeah, I'd be interested to know the results of your investigation. We just obviously want to make sure that we're avoiding expensive issues and safety issues as much as possible. Let me see what else. Oh, I know. How do we make sure? I don't know who this question is for, but how do we make sure? It seemed like there was a reoccurring issue where if projects were going over the agreed upon deadline, that the city wasn't assessing, and there were fees related to the late delivery of projects within the contract that we weren't assessing the fees. And that really worries me because obviously it's costing the city money when projects aren't completed on time. So why is that happening, and how do we make sure that we are assessing those fees when projects aren't delivered on time?
Good question, and I think that was referenced in that audit as well. So generally speaking, since I'm not speaking on one particular project, all projects have a contractual time requirement, and through the construction process, if there's design changes or there's unforeseen conditions, through the change order process, we evaluate that, we negotiate that with the contractor, we add days sometimes as needed on that particular contract. When we get to the end of the project, when the project is exceeded, the time that was allowed by contract or by negotiated change orders, there is a clause where we do liquidated damages, and that's probably what you're referring to for the delays. So on a case-by-case, we work with the contractors to, and we do assess that, just to clarify. When we have projects that don't meet the schedule and it's the contractor's fault, we do assess liquidated damages. But I would have to actually get more specifics on the examples you might be talking about. But generally speaking, that is part of the contract and the project management that we do. But in some cases, we'll work with the contractor if it was rain delays or if it was response time, either on the city side or the design team. But that's part of the process.
I mean, there is one specific example on page 10 that talks about final completion of Sand Hill contract was behind, liquidated damages of about $32,000 were not assessed, and decisions not to assess damages were not documented.
So I can speak to that one specifically, and that was really, Austin Energy was the primary kind of department responsible for that at the time. That was in 2011, so in reaching back our 8 years, we are pulling in some fairly older projects. Our concern with that was not only that it wasn't assessed, and it went pretty significantly over just the way that the contract was written. It was clear that the damages should have been assessed. And when the department explained that to us, they had what we thought was kind of a reasonable explanation, but coming in after the fact, it's very hard for us to tell should they or should they have not assessed those, given that the contract said absolutely will assess these a certain amount for every day. So at the time we made that recommendation, I believe that they, Austin Energy, in fact, we followed up later, Austin Energy implemented that recommendation and made sure that if they weren't going to assess it, that they had clear documentation of why. I think in that case it was kind of an adjustment between one project and another project that the contractor was involved in, and they felt like it was a fair way to handle it. It's just from an auditor perspective, we really like the documentation. So we were coming in and saying, we felt like if you're not going to assess something that's required in the contract, then you need to evaluate that and document why you did not.
So who is, there are, as you mentioned, this is such a huge, important issue because we have $5.5 billion that we're spending on these contracts. And I understand that it's difficult because they're in different departments and, we're doing a lot of different things in a lot of different areas as a city. And so it's hard to have, specific procedures always followed. But it does seem like were some recurring issues that could be easily addressed with making sure that the legal, that when we are doing our contracts, that the recommended legal language that protects the city if work is not done properly or if work is going over budget or, over the time deadline, that the city is protected. The monitoring, there were some comments about what happens when work was not performed in accordance with the contract, our inability to recover money, et cetera. So who is ultimately responsible? Who is ultimately responsible for making sure that these things are improved upon?
That's a great question.
I look to Mr. Scarborough to answer that question.
As we've discussed before, I'm a lifelong procurement professional. So my patented answer is the person who holds the pen is responsible. Ultimately, it's a function of delegation. The city charter and the council authorize the city manager to enter into and to execute and to expend monies against contracts, and then that authority is then subsequently delegated out through the city's management and operations staff. So through that structure of delegation, that is the city's procurement organization, and it lives in our office, it lives in capital contracting office, and it lives in larger and smaller amounts throughout the city. But ultimately, it's the person who signs the contract who's kind of responsible for making sure that all the players on that contract are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And I think some of what we're observing here is that connection needs some further examination. So, like I said, Chief Financial Officer's management team is looking closely at this report and intend to circle back with the city manager's office to see if there's some tightening up and some further review of city contract organization that may benefit some of the challenges that are identified in the report.
I mean, it's hard as, I guess I'll just speak for myself well, these kind of things are always difficult when the ultimate accountability for the success of these contracts is so scattered throughout the city. And so we have to figure out a way. I mean, I don't know how many people are ultimately signing contracts, and how do we get this information to them? Are they all, I don't know if they're watching the Audit and Finance Committee, or if there is someone who is bringing all those people together and highlighting the issues that have been found. To me, this is pretty clearly under the government that works strategic outcome. And so maybe when the city manager kind of completes his realignment, then there's going to be an assistant city manager whose ultimate job it is to make sure that these things are considered. But I just feel like there's a lot of money at stake here, and there's a lot of really good information in this audit, and I want to make sure that we're actually following through on the recommendations that are made and addressing the problems that are highlighted. And I'm not seeing a clear path of how to do that right now.
Can I address on the capital delivery side?
Sure.
As it relates to that, Public Works has the majority of the project managers in the city. And inspectors, we also have construction inspectors that are the eyes on the ground on the construction projects. And we work with capital contracting office in putting the contracts together. But when it comes to actually executing the work, our team is on the ground making sure that we're adhering to that contract. And the capital contracting office assists us in reviewing and pointing out when certain things aren't being done, so we can go back and take care of that. Capital delivery wide, citywide, Public Works does not manage every project in the city, as was discussed earlier. And right now, under Mr. Good, we're doing this initiative on capital delivery, reevaluating what's the most effective, making sure we have standardization, training. And so a lot of the tools that we already have in place, we're looking to improve them so we can make sure that everybody's adhering to the policies required for delivering capital projects.
Sure. Okay.
Good morning.
Good morning. Yes.
My name is Rolando Fernandez, Capital Contracting Officer. Just want to add a couple of things. Certainly, the review, the ownership of the documents, and the signature authority of the documents for construction-related contracts. The processes are there. I believe fully that the processes are there. We meet regularly with the law department. We meet regularly with Public Works and other departments that manage their own capital improvement projects. I think what you see is that maybe the consistency. We do a lot of projects. We do a lot of construction, professional services projects across the board. And I think the dynamics between, this kind of contracting with other kind of contracting the city does is that, you have a project manager that owns the responsibility on site. The contracting manager is not on site. They're not in the field working on a day-by-day basis with the project, with the contractor, overseeing the work. What we do is on the back end side, when there's a change order, when there's an issue on site, then we work with the project manager, law department, and my office to mitigate the best we can each issue. So that's there, but every project's different, and so what I will say though, and stand firm on, is that the contract requirements are there. The liquidated damage, for example, we have that in every project. Every project we determine the dollar value for that contract. We have our evaluation program on every contract. It's just being consistent on that side of it. So,
Councilmember Alter.
I just wanted to suggest to the chair that we have Public Works and other related departments who were involved with that particular audit. So, as I understand it, this is a report on all of the contracts and that contract audits. But I think it has raised the need for us to be looking at that a second time and understanding the progress that's being made as a check-in, preferably in December or possibly, in January. But I think in December, if we have time, I don't know if we have some kind of big thing on the agenda. But I think it would be valuable to dig into this a little bit deeper and to see if there are policy things that have to be done. And just as our role in audit and finance, I think we should be taking a deeper dive on that one. That that one. Some of our audits cover, 100,000 programs. This one is millions and millions of dollars, and so I think it would merit additional attention.
We can certainly schedule that. I think we have we have an upcoming item, I believe, on upcoming meetings or on meeting dates for 2019. So that's something kind of worth discussing. We do the December 5th agenda is somewhat full, but things always change. So we'll put this on the as a placeholder for the December meeting. And are you specifically asking about to have further discussion about just contracting in general, or capital contracts specifically, or really the topic of this audit, which is the many areas of contracting that we've looked at in the past?
Whatever was covered in the audit
Okay.
that had the public works stuff, that where the design issues were coming up and the
Okay.
other
So looking
pieces.
back to the capital project delivery.
That's
audit.
what I'm requesting.
Right.
Councilmember Troxclair may have a broader scope that she's in mind, but I thought that her comments
Okay.
were pretty focused on that
Yeah.
audit.
Well, and it always, I appreciate your comments, but it always worries me when we have an audit or an audit report that is highlighting areas that we need to improve, and then we have city staff saying, well, we're already doing it. And so
Right.
it's like, there is clearly a disconnect somehow in it, and it seems like there are some pretty clear areas. It's not, like I said, I understand that that you're managing a lot of projects, and so it's difficult. But it seems like there are some relatively easy fixes that are outlined in this report. So I just want to make sure that we're recognizing it's okay. You're doing a lot of things well, but I think it's also important to recognize the things where we could improve upon. So I think it's worth continued conversation as well.
Councilmember, we'd be happy to come back in December or whenever. I just want to clarify, I didn't have a copy of the report you were referring to today, but the audit report of 2017, we have taken action. We have done some quick wins, and that's in the report that we're giving an update on the 6-month report. So we'll be glad to give you more specifics at the next meeting.
Okay, yeah, and if you guys can make sure that you do have a copy of this report, I think it would be really helpful for y'all to read through and kind of give us your feedback.
So, council members, if I may make
Yes.
a suggestion, probably within the next 6 weeks, you'll be getting a complete 6-month report from my office with all of the items that are included in these audits. I could pull out a special report of just the ones that were looked at as part of these contract audits and give you a special status of where all of those recommendations are. Because I do believe, as we look back over the contract audits that were done, and I apologize, I haven't seen the full report either, but as we look back at those, some of them were probably over the last 3 or 4 years. So a lot of progress has been made since those items were brought before you, and departments have made significant efforts to make improvements. And I think if I can pull those out into a special report for you, that might give you some comfort as to where we are in the process. And then after that, if you still feel there's a need to bring all of the departments to this meeting for an update, then we can bring them at that time.
And I think that makes a lot of sense to pull out the subset. We did include information, the last reported status to the controller, in the appendix of the report. I think that handles a lot of them, but this is a great example of one. We completed the work in 2017. We haven't done any follow-up, and they haven't hit the point where they needed, until just now, where they needed to report the status to the controller. So this one is, I guess, recent enough that we haven't done a lot of follow-up work, and they haven't had to provide an update on where they are with implementing those recommendations. But at least based on my conversations with these folks and with the Director of Public Works, I know that they have been making progress on implementing those recommendations.
Okay, well, Councilmember Alter.
I would still like them to come speak on that audit. It's high profile enough, and I'm pleased that there's progress, and my assumption would have been that there was progress, but I think there's concern in the public about what we're doing as follow-on, and I'm perfectly pleased if you come and you tell us we've taken all these steps and we've done everything. That's great. I would much prefer that than to find other challenges, but I think we need to have that in an open session where people can hear about it.
That's great.
Oh, I was just going to make the point that this issue in general, whether it's competitive bidding or awarding points, or when we do get into legal trouble with a contract that this issue area occupies a lot of the council's time. Ultimately, when it's not. When issues come up after the fact, it's a thing that we spend a lot of time, whether it's an executive session or on the dais, kind of having discussions about. So to the extent that we can really make sure that we're tightening up our processes on the front end, I think that it's going to save us time on the back end, and of course help to protect the city and taxpayer dollars. So thank you. All right, we are losing people, and I know we're getting close to time here as well. So let's just speak quickly about